Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today about this very, very important topic. And I think, as the Chief of Navy said, circumstances have changed and they've changed quickly. And what we might have spoken about a couple of months ago or even a couple of weeks ago might have been a little bit different to today. One of the things I continually hear when I'm talking to people in government is the market will take care of it, or the last 40 years have been okay, why do we think that's going to change? And I think what we've seen in the last few weeks and months is why perhaps we need to be a little bit more vigilant and a little less reliant on what's happened in recent history and look a little bit further back, as Mark just did. So there's two things I really wanted to speak to you about today, and they are very, very related, but quite different as well. The first is, what is the capability that Australia needs in the maritime domain? And how do we get clarity? How do we try and decide as a nation what maritime capability we need? And the second thing I'd like to talk about is what happens, I think as people in Navy perhaps use the term, when the balloon goes up. What happens when we reach a point of conflict? And who is going to look after maritime trade? Because while we have a very capable Navy, it's very resource limited. And the issues of concurrence are going to be alive and well when we need our Navy to both protect our trade and to go and engage in conflict. So dealing with those two issues, if you like, at the same time, but slightly separately, we've just heard about the size of Australia's trading task. It's often said we have the 5th largest trading task in the world. We are a very isolated nation. We are a massive trading nation. We are a massive maritime nation. Other nations would give their eye teeth to have the maritime potential that we have. We've got a huge offshore oil and gas industry. We've got massive natural resources that we need to export. We have a huge requirement for import. We have diverse populations right around the coast, which means our coastal trading task is significant. And we have responsibility for masses of the world's oceans as well as the Antarctic region. We have one of the largest cruise industries. Every single box you could tick that say, if I was going to create a maritime nation, what would it look like? It would look like us. But what we've failed to do is take advantage of that in terms of building our Indigenous capability to actually manage that. And that's part of what I'm going to talk to you about today. The size of the Australian merchant fleet is pretty hard to get a handle on, and so any way you cut the numbers, you'll come up with a different figure. So I want to run you through what ships we have and what they look like. At the moment, there's roughly 50, if you want to say, Australian ships. So these are ships that carry the Australian flag and work with Australian crews on board. But if we break those down, very few of them are over 100 deadweight tonnes. Most of them are very small. They are effectively near coastal. They are landing barges, they are tug and barge operations, 5 expedition cruise vessels, all very, very capable craft for what they do. But if we're talking a maritime trade capability, we are not necessarily talking about the types of assets we might need. So what do we have? We have 8 ships that work across Bass Strait at the moment, ro-ro vessels. We have 5 dry bulk carriers, 5 expedition cruise vessels, 1 research vessel, 31 servicing Northern Australia, 4 international trading LNG carriers, and it's already been publicly announced they are slated to go. There's 3 dry bulk carriers that have Australian crew on it but are not Australian flagged, and we have a handful of platform supply vessels working in the offshore oil and gas sector. We have many more that have Australian crew on but they're not Australian flagged. Like I said, most of those ships are under 1,000 deadweight tonne. There's only about 13 that are of a size that we could use for any sort of international trade should we need to. And as much as we look at what we do have, it's important to look at what we don't have. We don't have any liquid fuel tankers. We don't have any LPG tankers. We don't have any ships capable of heavy lift, and we don't have any large cruise ships of the type that have been requisitioned in conflicts of the past. We don't have any container ships. We have ships capable of carrying containers in the ro-ros, but no container ships as you would think of them, the big ships that carry a lot of boxes where the efficiencies come in. So it's fair to say our strategic capability is seriously flawed. It is seriously limited with what we have available today. We're quite literally standing into danger. We've failed to equip ourselves with the capability we need to keep this country ticking if we can't rely on international supply chains. No other comparable nation has done this. Nations of our size, of our geography, of our remoteness have made sure that their Indigenous capability remains, and they have nurtured it carefully. And they've done that for good reason. They haven't done that because they're silly. They've done that because it makes good economic sense to have a maritime industry. They deliver huge amounts to the bottom line of those nations, but they've done it because it's important strategically. The other thing about our nation and our position in terms of a maritime trade sense is obviously we're a huge maritime trading nation. We need our ports to function, and for the ports to function, we need secure maritime skills, strategic maritime skills, the harbour masters, the marine pilots, the VTS operators and so on. And there is only really one path to get there, and that's to spend time at sea, to obtain years and years at sea as a master mariner to become qualified to fill those roles. What we're increasingly doing, because we don't have the assets available anymore in the Australian context, is losing that skills base. It is very difficult. There are a number of structural hurdles in place for Australian seafarers to go overseas to gain the right amount of time to come back and fill those jobs. It's not impossible, but it is tricky. Now, this is not because there's a shortage of people who want that career. Far from it. We turn people away all the time from pursuing a career at sea because there is no job at the end of the training for them. We conducted a skills census last year. It's available freely if anyone wants a copy of it. And what it says is we're looking at a 560-person shortage by 2023 in this industry. And that is not because we can't recruit people. Other OECD nations have that problem. They can't find the people who want the career in the maritime sector. We just don't have the jobs. And I'm trying to find sea time at the moment for two young guys who've got themselves as far as they can possibly get, but they need that little bit extra. This is the reality of where we're at. We stopped going to careers expos about 8 years ago because we were holding out a false promise, because there's no assets, there's no work opportunities. And that's a problem for the country because it means we can't fill those strategic roles ashore, and they are not negotiable. We might be able to do without the ships. I don't think we can, but if you think you can, but we can't do without the ports. So the defence and merchant marine are inextricably linked, and our interests are much the same. And what we need to do is make sure that the expertise and the know-how that exists in both sectors remains, because if we lose it from the merchant, then the Navy's going to be on their own. Relying on the market to take care of it is pretty short-sighted. And I think the more we hear that, the more pessimistic we become that that's going to be something that actually will stand the test of time. When I talk about what other nations have done to nurture their industries, it's fair to say international shipping it's incredibly international. It is competitive. And those nations have a raft of policies in place that do one or more of three things. They incentivise, they subsidise, or they protect. In many cases, they do at least two of those three. In Australia, we don't do any. And we need to get on board, because the reason we don't have the assets is because businesses cannot afford to run their business with the sorts of regulations in place in this country. We need to start to engage with what our nation needs to succeed. So what we need to do is move to secure our skills base, and in doing so we can secure some of the important trade lanes for this country. So what Mile has been calling for many years now is the creation of a strategic capability, a strategic fleet. And that's identifying that we need a capability for skills development, for supply chain security, and for national requirement for requisition should it be needed. Mark just put up a slide that said, in the past what we would need to do is start requisitioning ships. What is there to requisition? What are you going to ask for from industry? 3 dry bulk carriers aren't going to be much good to anybody if we get to that point. What we need to do is acknowledge that if there's a need for requisitioning, we need those assets to be available, and at the moment, they don't exist. So how we think the strategic fleet would work, other nations do something similar, but we need something particular for our circumstance. We need ships that are operating commercially 365 days of the year. But because of the cost differential they will wear by virtue of being Australian, they will need a retainer from the government to offset the difference for the users of those shipping services. When the government should need them, they would then be available for requisition. There's a retainer that's been paid for that. But they have to be operated on a sustainable cost base, and we don't shy away from this for 1 minute. We need not be intimidated by the workforce in the maritime industry. We need enterprise agreements that are realistic and that are sustainable. We need no strike agreements. We need concessions from the workforce. This will not succeed without that. And that is a very real part of making this plan work. So this isn't about eliminating foreign flag participation from any of our work. At the moment, it's the Australian flag that's been eliminated from all of Australia's needs. And what we want to do is put a little bit of it back. If there's any criticism to be made of the strategic fleet plan, it's that we're not asking for enough. We've done some back of the envelope calculations. If we looked at 20 ships, it would provide about 900 jobs. It would train about 100 seafarers a year, and it would require about $200 million per annum in government funding. It's a rounding error in the federal budget. But if there's a criticism, it's that that's not enough. 20 ships wouldn't be enough. But I tell you what, it's 20 ships more than we've got now. And that's important if we're looking down the path of requisitioning. To put that in perspective, that's about the same as 0.7% of road funding, 2.5% of rail funding that's available in this country. If we want to think about some of the other legislative programs that support other transport modes, aviation has a watertight cabotage regime in this country. So if we think cargo reservation for Australian interests around the coast is something we shouldn't be talking about, and we don't think we need that sort of strict cabotage regime, but aviation has it. It is not beyond the pale for this government to go there. We think it's a small price to pay to secure a reliable source of trained seafarers, professionals to run our nation's ports, pilot the visiting ships and ensure the safety environment standards are up to scratch. Not to mention having the critical mass of assets available to look after our national interest should that be required. Now, just finally, I think I'm out of time. We're very supportive of the right of freedom of navigation, and we're therefore very supportive of the government's decision to send some presence in the Middle East to protect that interest. I was surprised by the Chief of Navy's figure of about 40% of our fuel coming through there. I thought it was more like 15, which is, but I'm happy to be wrong, which is considerable. There's no question that we need to protect the right of freedom of navigation. And as I said, we're very aware that the Navy is limited. We're very aware of these issues of concurrence, and we're very aware that we are entirely reliant on foreign shipping to service the needs of this nation. We're very aware that there is nothing really left to requisition should we need it, either in terms of supporting our military or in terms of servicing the country when we need that. Our message to government is that we need some policy change, we need a vision like a strategic fleet, and we need everyone to buy in to make sure it can work, because it can work if we put our heads together and we don't shy away from some of the difficult conversations that go with it. Thank you.